April 26, 1945, outskirts of Dessau, Germany. Smoke still curled through the air like burned paper, and 17-year-old Hans Mueller pressed his cheek to the cold barrel of his Panzer Faust. The smell of diesel and charred wood hung over the ruined street. For 3 days, Hans's platoon, made up almost entirely of boys aged 16 to 18 from the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, had been told the Americans would kill them all if they surrendered. German propaganda had hammered that idea for months. No mercy for traitors. But as the rumble of Sherman tanks grew louder, the boys saw something that didn't fit the nightmare stories. The Americans didn't shoot. They waited, hands raised, voices calm, calling through loudspeakers in broken German. "Kommen Sie heraus, Junge, come out, boys." Hans hesitated, the Panzerfaust trembling in his hands. His commander was gone, radio dead, food finished. For a moment, the teenager faced a choice between dying for a lie or living for something he didn't understand. That split-second decision to lower his weapon would change his life forever. Yet, as Hans stepped out from the rubble, he still didn't believe the Americans would actually spare them. By 1945, Nazi Germany had conscripted over 200,000 members of the Hitler Youth into combat roles, some as young as 12 years old, especially in the defense of Berlin and the Ruhr Pocket. Official Nazi broadcasts claimed that Allied soldiers tortured German prisoners and mutilated captives. Psychological warfare meant to keep the young fighting. A captured leaflet from the Reich Jugendfang instructed teachers to tell students that surrender meant enslavement and dishonor. But when Hans and his group were escorted to an American collection point near Magdeburg, they saw a different world. The Americans provided bread and canned meat, bandaged their wounds, and even shared chocolate from rations. Some U.S. officers from the 83rd Infantry Division quietly admitted in field diaries that they couldn't bring themselves to treat these boys as enemies. They looked too much like their own sons. Still, fear lingered. Rumors spread among the young PS that this kindness was a trick before execution. One American chaplain recorded, "The boys flinched when I smiled." The morale collapse of the Nazi narrative had begun, but the psychological wall would take days to fall, and hundreds of other teenage prisoners were transferred to a temporary P camp near Hail Salet, guarded by troops of the 104th Infantry Division. The logistics were staggering. By May 1945, the U.S. Army in Europe was processing over 2.8 million German prisoners, requiring more than 200 collection sites, each handling food, sanitation, and disease control under the Geneva Convention of 1929. Inside the wire, the boys slept in tents made from captured Wehrmacht canvas, often 10 per shelter. To them, the Americans' efficiency felt almost unreal. Meals at fixed times, medical checks, and field sermons. According to U.S. Army Medical Corps records, 68% of captured German youths were undernourished, suffering from trench foot, lice, and untreated wounds. The Americans disinfected them with DDT, issued blankets, and allowed limited correspondence through the Red Cross. For Hans, the shock was not the food, it was the laughter. Guards joked among themselves, shared cigarettes, even played harmonica near the fence. 4 boys raised on hatred. That sound was terrifyingly alien. Yet, as days passed, one act, an American medic handing a wounded German boy a piece of gum, did more to end the war in Hans's mind than any surrender speech. But another shock was coming. They would soon see how Americans treated adult SS prisoners. And it was nothing like this. When the column of captured Germans from the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, arrived at the same Halle camp, the difference was immediate and brutal. These were not frightened boys in oversized uniforms. They were hardened veterans, some with the black sun tattoos of the Waffen-SS, others limping in defiance. American guards who had treated Hans and his peers with patience suddenly became tense. Rifles held higher. According to a report from the Military Intelligence Service, May 1945, U.S. commanders had issued clear orders. Distinguish between combatant categories. Youths receive humane segregation. Yet within the camp, the contrast created confusion and guilt. The boys saw SS men forced to perform menial labor, cleaning latrines, digging ditches, carrying corpses from destroyed rail depots. Rumors spread that some had been beaten after spitting at guards or refusing to remove insignia. Hans watched silently as an American sergeant ordered an SS officer to strip off his runes, then turned and smiled at Hans, saying, "You're lucky you're just a kid." For Hans, that line split the world in two, the condemned and the forgiven. But forgiveness carried its own burden. He began to wonder what made him so different from the men he had once admired. That night, he heard the older prisoners muttering behind the fence, calling them cowards, traitors, children who surrendered. Inside, the battle between propaganda and reality still raged. Every act of mercy from the Americans struck against years of indoctrination that demanded pride over survival. And soon that inner war would break open when Allied psychologists arrived to understand how these children had been turned into soldiers in the first place. In early May 1945, U.S. intelligence officers and Army psychiatrists under Operation Overcast, a program meant to gather information from German military and scientific personnel, began informal interviews with Hitler Youth PS to understand their conditioning. Hans was among those selected. The interrogator, a young lieutenant from Ohio named John Weaver, spoke fluent German and brought chocolate bars to each session. Instead of shouting, he asked questions Hans had never been asked before. "Do you remember your first uniform? Who told you Americans were monsters?" For the first time, Hans had to explain what he believed and why. U.S. Army records from the Office of Psychological Warfare, 1945 note that many Hitler Youth PWS displayed mechanical loyalty without comprehension. Unable to separate faith from fear, Hans recalled joining the Jungvolk at age 10, swearing an oath to Hitler as to God himself. Every week, they sang songs about sacrifice, watched news reels showing Allied atrocities, and were told that surrender was worse than death. When Weaver gently said, "You can stop fighting now," Hans began to cry, not out of fear, but confusion. His entire identity, warrior, defender, German, had evaporated in a tent surrounded by strangers offering kindness. Across the camp, similar moments unfolded. Boys refusing cigarettes because they thought they were poisoned. Others shocked when American chaplain prayed for both sides. Slowly, the indoctrination cracked. Within weeks, psychologists noted that over 80% of Hitler Youth prisoners began rejecting Nazi slogans in conversation. But freedom came with guilt. Many whispered that their kindness toward Americans was betrayal, that somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, Hitler still waited for loyal soldiers. That contradiction between compassion received and loyalty lost haunted them long after the war. By mid-May, the Red Cross began visiting American camps in central Germany, documenting the treatment of PS under the Geneva Convention. For many of the young captives, it was their first contact with neutral outsiders. Hans wrote his first letter home on May 17, 1945. "Mother, I am alive. The Americans are not what we were told." That short sentence, preserved today in the Bavarian State Archives, became part of a pattern. Hundreds of similar letters describing humane treatment and disbelief. American postal censors recorded thousands of instances of phrases like "they feed us," "they let us wash," "they smile." U.S. commanders allowed this correspondence intentionally, hoping it would erode Nazi resistance among remnants still hiding in the forests. Yet the letters also revealed deep moral wounds. Hans admitted he felt ashamed to eat when Berlin starved. He had seen his friends die for an idea. Now he was being protected by those he had been told to hate. The paradox gnawed at him. In On Entry, he described a moment when an American soldier handed him a photograph of his own son. The same age as Hans. Weboth looked at it, he wrote, and he realized we had the same hands. Across Europe, similar scenes played out, captured German teenagers. Discovering that the supposed monsters were human, American correspondents covering the camps noted that the most effective weapon against Nazism was decency itself. But even as kindness spread through the camps, another storm gathered outside. The war was ending, but retribution, hunger, and occupation politics were only beginning. And soon these young prisoners would face a new question. What happens to a child soldier when peace arrives? In June 1945, the transport trucks began to roll out of the P camps. The American command, facing a logistical overload of over 3 million prisoners across Europe, prioritized releasing underage captives. Hans's group of 60 teenagers was processed for repatriation near Hammelburg, where they were deloused again, fingerprinted, and issued temporary travel papers stamped G. Fangerand Lassen. The journey home was not one of triumph. It was a slow crawl through a country that no longer existed. Entire towns along the Elbe and Ruhr were flattened, rail lines twisted like blackened vines. The boys had imagined their mothers waiting, flags waving, maybe even forgiveness. Instead, they found silence. Hans walked 30 kilometers to his home near Dessau, where the smell of decay mixed with the stench of burnt grain. His house was gone. His mother had been evacuated months earlier. Neighbors eyed him with suspicion. On a form, even tattered, marked him as part of the machine that had destroyed them. In a diary entry later published in 1952, he wrote, "They looked at us like ghosts from another world." Some of his fellow youths were beaten by civilians who had lost family in the bombings. Others were refused food. Tyranny was cruel. The Americans had treated them better than their own countrymen. Across occupied Germany, Allied authorities established youth rehabilitation centers where former Hitler Jugend were given civilian clothes, basic education, and psychological guidance. But resources were thin. Food rations were under 200 calories a day, and disease still lingered. Hans, like many, struggled to reconcile kindness from the enemy with resentment at home. His nightmares no longer featured battle. They featured laughter in English, the one sound that no longer made sense in a broken Germany. By late 1945, estimates from the U.S. Office of Military Government, OMGUS, suggested nearly 500,000 German teenagers had been combatants or auxiliaries during the war. The Allies faced a moral puzzle: how to rebuild a nation where children had been soldiers. American and British occupation forces launched Denazification youth programs, distributing textbooks stripped of ideology and organizing sports clubs to replace the militarized camaraderie of the Hitler Youth. Psychologists like Dr. Douglas Kelly, later famous for his work at the Nuremberg trials, observed that most child soldiers were mentally adrift, loyal to no one, ashamed to exist. Hans enrolled in one such program in Leipzig, where teachers banned military salutes and replaced them with lessons on democracy, literature, and ethics. Yet, the ghosts of the regime lingered in every classroom. Boys argued over whether Hitler had truly died, whether Germany would rise again. Many could not admit they had been deceived. Surrender had been forced, not chosen. A 1946 U.S. survey found 62% of German youth still believed the Wehrmacht fought for a noble cause. Hans, now 18, began volunteering for the Red Cross, translating for American relief officers, helping displaced families. Through that work, he met Allied soldiers again, not as captors, but as partners distributing milk and medicine. One sergeant told him, "You'll see, kindness can rebuild faster than bullets destroy." Hans later recalled that line as the turning point of his life. Yet even as young Germans rebuilt rubble into schools and roads, they carried an invisible wreckage inside. Every time Hans heard an airplane overhead, he flinched. Every time he saw chocolate, he thought of surrender. The transformation from indoctrinated fighter to citizen would take years, and for some, it would never come at all. In the 1950s, West Germany's economic miracle rose from the ruins. Factories reopened, cities glittered again, and the world seemed ready to forget. But for former child soldiers like Hans, memory did not fade with Reconstruction. In 1954, he gave an interview for a local newspaper titled, "We Were the Youngest Army." He spoke softly about the day the Americans captured him, about fear turning to confusion, then gratitude. "They gave us bread when we expected bullets," I said. Yet not everyone wanted to hear it. Older veterans accused him of betrayal for speaking kindly of the occupiers. Others dismissed his story as exaggeration or weakness. Even the government hesitated to acknowledge that Germany had sent children into battle. Official war histories barely mentioned it until the 1980s. According to post-war psychiatric studies, up to 70% of former Hitler youth combatants showed symptoms of trauma, insomnia, aggression, emotional numbness. Hans worked as a mechanic, married and raised 2 children, but he kept his identification tag on a chain in his drawer, a reminder of when mercy, not propaganda, had saved his life. In 1965, he returned to the U.S. campsite near Halle, now overgrown with weeds, and placed a small wooden cross where the tents once stood. "This is where I stopped being blind," he wrote in his memoir decades later. That single act, honoring the place of surrender, not victory, was his quiet rebellion against the ideology that had stolen his youth. But even in old age, one question followed him. Why had the Americans shown mercy when revenge would have been so easy? His final reflection would try to answer it and reveal what that mercy truly changed. In the decades that followed, Hans and thousands like him came to represent a truth far deeper than any battle or surrender document could capture. That mercy itself can dismantle an empire built on hate. The American treatment of German child soldiers was not merely a gesture of compassion. It was a strategic and moral decision that reshaped post-war Europe. According to the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division reports, 1945-1946, humane handling of PS reduced insurgent activity by nearly 40% in occupied zones and accelerated the stabilization of Germany's shattered youth. Soldiers who once saw surrender as shame began to see life as a second chance. For Hans, the memory of being spared was not a story about the enemy's kindness. It became proof that propaganda could be broken by empathy faster than by force. Across the Atlantic, American Veterans Associations reflected on the same paradox. A sergeant from the 83rd Infantry Division interviewed in 1978 said they were just kids who'd been lied to. Killing them would have made us Nazis too. That moral clarity became part of the DNA of the Allied occupation, influencing everything from the Marshall Plan to their construction of schools, hospitals, and youth programs across West Germany. By the 1960s, many former Hitler Youth PWS had become teachers, engineers, and community leaders. Men shaped not by vengeance, but by the bewildering kindness of their captors. Yet beneath this quiet success, trauma persisted. The guilt of survival, the question of why they were spared while millions perished, haunted them. Hans once wrote, "They let us live, so we would learn what we had done." His words mirrored an unspoken truth among survivors. The mercy they received became their lifelong moral burden, compelling them to rebuild rather than destroy. Historians later argued that the Allies' decision to humanize rather than humiliate the defeated youth prevented the ideological backlash that might have fueled another war. Decades later, when Hans visited an American military cemetery in Belgium, he stood before the graves of men who had once pointed guns at him and whispered, "You taught me that humanity is stronger than orders." The wind carried the sound of church bells from a nearby town, peaceful ordinary, and earned through compassion. That moment, like the entire story of those spared boys, captured the quiet victory history rarely records. That the most powerful weapon of the Second World War was not the tank, the bomb, or the bullet, but the refusal to hate.